Hello everyone, how are you going? And welcome to Why Canada Doesn't Care About These Towns. Now clearly off the start here we can see there's obviously a very cold and very wet environment, and that is something that is seen throughout much of Canada just due to its size and geography, but that still doesn't answer why these towns just aren't cared about.
Imagine living in an isolated far northern community. You're surrounded by wilderness, and often in the winter the entire area is blanketed by ice and snow. There are no major roads in or out of town, and often to go shopping or to get medical supplies, you have to take a 14-hour journey by train.
What?
This isn't some wild made-up scenario though. This is the way of life in Schefferville, Quebec, an old mining town of only 213 people. At first glance, it seems to just be like any other small town in remote northeastern Canada. However, the sense of normality fades once you notice the train station. Canada is a country by no means known for rail travel, but the train station in Schefferville is the lifeline for the community here. But once the mines dried up, the train stopped servicing Schefferville, leaving its mostly indigenous inhabitants isolated.
Whoa, that is a serious thing to start to unpack there. My goodness, the fact that I was first wondering why they were possibly going to have a rail line all the way there and not a road, but the fact that it was a mining town just ticks that box, doesn't it? I mean, in saying that, it certainly doesn't help the fact that it is still a 14-hour train ride, and honestly, I'm always surprised that trains can do so well in snow and ice and all those kind of situations. I would have thought that, I don't know, I just wouldn't have thought that they'd be able to do that, but I guess they can just clear the rail as they go. However, something that did catch me off guard was the amount of buildings and houses that are just located in this small town of apparently 213. As honestly, from what we can see here, there is almost 213 buildings there, and so I don't know if everyone gets their own residence or how that is working. Maybe there were just a whole bundle of vacancies and things like that, but the fact that there are only 213 people here is pretty darn impressive that that's an entire community still able to operate with only 213 people. I mean, I want to know where they're getting their power from, where they're getting their water from, where they're getting their general resources from, and building materials. I mean, I don't know, there are so many challenges with living in a remote area like this, but I guess you can just train it all in if you really need to, and that is why, like you said, it is the lifeblood of this kind of town.
Schefferville is part of an area historically inhabited by indigenous peoples, who have lived there for potentially thousands of years. But to understand this story, we have to zoom out and examine this stretch of land that crosses down from this part of Quebec through Labrador and back into Quebec, all the way to the small city of Sept-Îles, far away from the major cities in the more southern province.
Yeah, look at that.
For millennia, this area has been inhabited by peoples such as the Innu and the Niskapis. Eventually, the French colonized much of this land, leading to the most commonly spoken language being French. English started to become fairly common as well. The town, now known as Schefferville, is fairly young as far as settlements go. It was established formally in 1954 by the Iron Ore Company of Canada as a way of supporting mining operations in the area. And a railway was built in the region to help carry ore supplies and passengers. This was part of the Quebec North Shore and Labrador Railway, or the QNSL for short.
That is one hell of a railroad. I mean, just look at the length of it, because we were talking about Canada here. If that was Northern Ireland, I could go, okay, that's maybe 20 kilometers, but no, that is going to be hundreds of kilometers. Look, you can even see the lines of longitude and latitude on this. To be fair though, the distance is certainly not the main concern that you're going to be having when trying to build through that kind of terrain. I mean, just how marshy and how wet and how just treacherous so many of these areas are going to be. It's constantly just going to be undulating and bogging down, and everything's going to be getting stuck, and that is actually quite a common story throughout much of Canada. Honestly, every single time I hear about any of these large-scale infrastructure projects, I'm just blown away by the fact that they're even able to be maintained, but let alone built in the first place. I mean, I guess if nothing else, that does show you the true power of money and just truly what can be accomplished when there is money to be made. You know, there is no way that that railway would have been ever made if it was just government money. People would go, why are we going to build a railway from the middle of nowhere up into the further middle of nowhere? But all of a sudden, iron is discovered, and they go, yeah, no worries, yeah, that's fine, yeah, just build it however you want, just however long you want, wherever you want, just get our oil from here to there.
To help construct the railway and even work the mines, members of the Innu and Niskapi peoples were forced to resettle to the area in and around Schefferville.
Why?
And as we've established, it gets cold in Schefferville. It once reached minus 50 degrees Celsius. Without proper insulation and housing, the conditions here can prove deadly. Though they were brought in to be workers, their communities faced neglect and discrimination from the local government. And within a decade, most of them were living in extremely poor conditions.
Alright, well I think I finally figured out why the title is what it is, and that is certainly just such a shame. Even the fact that they were forced to move or maybe relocate or whatever you want to be calling it, just into these areas that then they would have been supported by, but then they were just forced into mining operations as well. Like the entire thing is just so... Oh, it is just so weird and wrong. I mean, I guess I have to put it in the context of the 50s where things were certainly different. Maybe not in this particular town, but worldwide things were very different to what they are today. However, what I can never fathom is why these people are just all of a sudden neglected, because for goodness sake, they were brought there or forced to live there, did the construction and were exploited in that regard, and then all of a sudden the mining town just shuts down and everything just goes back to what it was apparently. But no, you're just leaving these people behind just in the middle of nothing, because I can hardly imagine that there would have been any efforts made to have any cultural conservation, and so these people would have been stripped of what they once had and then stripped again of what they just managed to rebuild.
Things started to change in the late 1960s. Housing units were finally built for the local indigenous peoples, and part of the area was declared a reservation. These are territories set aside by the Canadian government for First Nations people. In 1970, iron mining was hitting its peak in the area. To deal with this, more workers were brought in, and the population hit a high of around 5,000 people.
Wow.
But over the next decade, iron deposits began to dry up, and mining focuses shifted elsewhere. In 1982, the iron mining around Shefferville completely stopped, on orders from the president of the Iron Ore Company of Canada, Brian Mulroney, who would later be elected Prime Minister of Canada.
This entire situation just becomes more and more devastating by the second. The fact that it's such a merry-go-round of politics and money and massive corporations and things like that. The fact that you can go from being president of the Iron Ore Company and then just abandoning the town and then even just become prime minister of the country as well. Now, I'd love to know how many people were living there when he actually shut it down, because they said it was a peak of 5,000, but that could have been very, very reduced by that time. Either way, obviously the First Nations people were still living there and apparently still live there.
Things quickly began to decline in Shefferville and many of the surrounding towns.
That will happen. Day too.
Within a few years, most of the non-Indigenous residents had left. By 1986, so many people had left the town that it lost its status as an incorporated settlement.
Wow.
With that came a decline in the municipal services. By 1991, only 110 people remained. However, Shefferville lives on today. The town continued moving forward, slowly and more physically disconnected from the wider world. The only saving grace is the small local airport and the railway. In the 1970s, the QNSL operated multiple daily freight and passenger trains from Shefferville through Labrador and back into Quebec, terminating in Sept-Îles.
Wow. How far is that? Because to be having multiple services a day, but then apparently also having a 14-hour journey just doesn't really ever add up. It's usually, okay, it's a big journey, happens once a day, once a week, something like that, not multiple times a day, especially when the entire town is declining. And so I'm not sure if I'll be able to find it on the map, because I know it's general area, but not, oh, well, there it is, actually popped in. Wow, I guess it's on the map somewhat, but here we go. Let's just go from Shefferville all the way down to, all the way down to here. Okay, it is 500 kilometers. That is one hell of a train ride, and that is as the crow flies. So it's probably more like 650 kilometers, and you got multiple a day. That is very, very, very impressive, and I don't really understand why they would have done that at that time.
Passenger and freight services would continue, subsidized in part by the Canadian government. However, even with government subsidies, the QNSL was unable to profit from passenger services. That's not to mention the logistical challenges of operating this rail line.
Yeah,
some stops along the line are literally at cabins or camps, and often in the winters these are covered in several feet of snow. And remember, northeastern Canada is far away from, well, nearly everything. There's no major highways and it is sparsely developed, and the railway is dotted with old bridges and tunnels. To add to this, the QNSL operates on an isolated rail network. This means that the tracks are completely separate from the main Canadian rail network. So this passenger route was unprofitable and had a ton of logistical nightmares. Here's an idea, said one of the stakeholders in the company. Let's find a way to rid ourselves of this passenger service.
I mean, I guess if you're being a business-minded person, that it does make sense. If you're just having outgoings that are just costing you too much, it makes sense. I understand that business has to be business, but for goodness sake, the fact that you set up this town and then you were just trying your darndest just to abandon them is outrageous. Oh, it's just so disgusting at the same time. Especially because, like you said, it isn't connected to anything else, and that is because it was originally a private rail network and basically still is. But instead of getting rid of it, maybe just look at extending it, and then all of a sudden you might have a bit more tourism, you might have have a bit more growth. You might have so many other things that finally enable this entire place to become profitable outside of just mining. But no, that is just too hard. That just defeats the entire purpose of just trying to shut the entire thing down. And so honestly, I'm kind of surprised that the government didn't then step in and just enable the entire thing to be built. I mean, like I already said, I do understand that it's a very difficult place to be building and such is going to be costing a lot of money to be building it. But honestly, you've already built all across Canada. What's another little railway just to connect two major systems together?
It didn't matter if doing so ran the risk of further isolating local communities. Their bottom line was being thrown into question.
Yeah, exactly.
As this was all happening, it was thought that perhaps Via Rail, the Canadian government-owned rail service, would take over the route. But that would never be the case, perhaps due to the tiny population or operational costs, but nobody seemed to be interested in taking over this rail service. So let's head back to Schefferville. Knowing that their only viable link to the rest of Canada was in jeopardy, representatives of 3 different local Indigenous band councils came together to try to take over operations in the early 2000s. And the Churiton Rail Transportation Company was formed and entered into negotiation to purchase the track that ran south from Schefferville to Emerald Junction. This is the point where the main QNSL line splits off towards Labrador City. In late 2005, both parties reached an agreement. They received the desired track along with the rights to operate passenger services on the rest of the QNSL line. And it cost them just $1 Canadian.
That is pretty darn ridiculous that they were able to wangle that deal down to $1. I mean, for goodness sake, just give it to them for free, give it to them for 10 cents, whatever it may be. Why $1? I mean, I guess it sounds good if nothing else. And I guess also, at least from what I gathered, it isn't exactly though they got all the land and all the infrastructure associated with the entire rail line. No, they just got the rights to operate their own service under their own schemes and under their own budgets and things like that. Actually, hang on a second, I just wanted to double check it, but no, they did actually manage to secure a whole bundle of the track as well, which is utterly ridiculous at the fact that they got it for $1. I mean, I guess when it's just mining money and it's already been paid off, no one really cares about what it's worth. And especially, like I said, if no one wants to buy it, then just go for it. Just have it, please. Just take it for $1. Sure, go for it. Especially considering I can only imagine they wouldn't be then responsible for the maintenance and the upkeep and so many other things that are a part of that part of the line. And so especially if you got tunnels and bridges and all these other things that require some pretty serious maintenance, I don't know where that money's coming from, but that is going to be a decent outlay that company just doesn't want to have to deal with, not for 213 people. And so it is amazing how that for anyone that lives in a city, this is just another generic resource in the same way that you have roads and planes and even drones, for goodness sake, you have all this infrastructure just at your whim. But then when you really only have one of those, it absolutely becomes the lifeblood of the entire community and really the sole reason that it exists as it does today. So even though I can only imagine that something like that would serve up its fair share of challenges and just problems that you have to deal with at the same time, at least they just know that if they want to fix it, if they can fix it, it's not going to get shut down because they control it.
It was more of a ceremonial handover of essential services than of a proper corporate sell, which I guess just shows how much the QNSL or the Canadian government cared about this railroad. A frequent service would resume in December of 2005, and perhaps this is just me coming from a European perspective, but calling it frequent is perhaps a little bit generous. The TRT operates a singular train that runs in each direction either once or twice a week, depending on the time of year. On most journeys, the trip will last around 14 hours, often depending on the number of stops, the weather conditions, and if there's any conflict with the QNSL freight trains, the trip takes nearly 24 hours.
Yeah.
There is also a driver swap that occurs at Emerald Junction. After this, a QNSL engineer takes over, though it's still considered part of the TRT.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare in its own right. So then, oh man, you really are just having to deal with both parties in the same rail network. I mean, even the fact that they just got the same trains or still got freight going along it, I mean, that doesn't make any sense to me because I thought that was the entire point of them buying it is because there was nothing going on anymore. No mining, no freight, no anything. And that's why they were going to shut it down. But I guess obviously there's still something going on there. I mean, I do generally agree that calling it a frequent service is probably a little bit too generous considering that it could go from taking 14 hours to 24 hours and some weeks it just probably doesn't even run at all. But to be fair, like I already kind of mentioned, that is certainly more in line with what my expectations of such a service would be, especially through that kind of wilderness. That is no easy trek, and changeovers and the logistics of that, no, that sounds like a nightmare just to be doing every single day. Would never happen.
Tickets are just under 175 Canadian dollars for a round trip from Sepzil to Schefferville, which does seem like quite a lot at first, but keep in mind this isn't a tourist railway. There's only one seat class, coach. There is a dining car on board, along with a microwave, if you need it, but there's no sleeping car, and a good portion of the train is dedicated to cargo. The only intent of the TRT is to transport local peoples and supplies. While there have been no major line expansions since 2005, the TRT has done some upgrades. In 2017, this new train station was opened in Schefferville. And in 2021, they were granted a 55 million Canadian dollar grant from the Canadian Infrastructure Bank and the provincial government of Quebec to modernize their operations. The TRT plans to do station upgrades and to add Wi-Fi on board the trains, because much of the region lacks phone service. You're not going to be getting 5G, 4G, or even 3G out in northeastern Canada. They also plan to acquire a new, more efficient diesel locomotive, as none of the current lines are electrified. This is all great news because the current equipment is aging, and as we've seen, the railway is vital to the community and its connection to the outside world. It's also become a major source of employment for these towns, and it's a way for groups of people who have lived in a place for generations to exercise control over their own lands. Whether as a source of pride, resource shipping, or transportation, and having to navigate the sometimes icy geography of the region it crosses through, the TRT is a truly vital asset to this part of Canada. Which brings us back to Schefferville. Small, remote, but a vital part of several communities of Indigenous peoples, who keep much of this part of Canada truly alive by operating this rather unconventional railway.
Well, fair play to that entire community and the investment they have made just to keep this thing going, especially when it was once on the brink of collapse and going, no, we live here, this is our home, we need this service, this is the only service besides planes, which I can only imagine is going to be a lot more expensive than trains, especially when you're talking about big objects like cars and building materials and so many of those kind of things that just are not going to be viable to move via the air whatsoever. And so, especially when you have this railway already in, but are threatening to be shut down, you just be going, we're in between a rock and a hard place, we don't have the money, we don't have the backing, we don't have the knowledge, and we don't have this. But when you just put your mind to it, you go, nah, we're keeping it, even if it costs us $1. But anyway, in saying that, I reckon I am just finally going to call it there. So thank you for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, feel free to do the algorithmic things down below. Also, if this is the first video of mine that you are watching, then make sure to go check out my other ones. Also, make sure to go check out the original video down in the description below. Or hey, maybe you even just want to consider subscribing so that you don't miss another one of these in the future. But all in all, have a good one and see ya.